Now we want to use the labor supply and demand model to examine certain policy issues or certain things in the world to have a better understanding of what the policy issues are. First, we're going to consider several different things to consider here. One is the idea of discrimination. Another is minimum wage laws. A third is labor unions and licensing of professionals, or having a particular exam you might have to take, like bar exams for lawyers. We also want to consider something called compensating wage differentials. We'll consider that as well, just define what it is, deferred compensation, and different ways to pay people, whether it's a fixed salary or piece rate or bonuses. And in all these cases, it affects incentives. So let's consider them using the supply and demand model as best we can. So let's first consider discrimination, a very important topic in the workplace. And how would you analyze the problem of discrimination against certain individuals or certain types of individuals? How would you analyze this with labor supply and labor demand model? Well, we've derived these. Remember, the marginal revenue product is where the labor demand curve comes from, and the labor supply curve comes from individuals maximizing their utility. And for a market as a whole, we've summed up the individuals and the firms as well. So in this picture, we've drawn the supply curve, and we have two demand curves. One, which is labeled, is called actual marginal revenue product. So that's the marginal revenue product that the firms can get from a worker. It's the marginal revenue product based on how productive they are. We've derived that based on the productivity of the worker. But suppose that the employer was prejudiced against certain types of individuals. Then one way to characterize that is they say, hey, it's just not producing as well. I'm going to argue it's the marginal product is not as so high. And so the prejudiced firm who discriminates, often it's against the law, but whether it is or not, a prejudiced firm is going to act as if the marginal revenue product is lower than it actually is. And that can be represented very easily in the diagram. So we have a prediction as a result of this prejudice. The result of this discrimination causes wages to fall, and it falls by this amount, basically by roughly the amount that the demand curve shifts down. And of course, you're moving along the supply curve as well, but no question the wage declines. And then in addition, this discrimination also lowers employment. Certain people won't be hired. It's basically two of the problems that discrimination causes, two of the economic problems that it causes: lower wages for those discriminated against and lower employment for those discriminated against. The interesting thing that comes out of this, though, is more than that, and that's important, but it's more than that. It's very interesting that if this is a competitive model, which we argue it is, we've derived it from competing firms in a competitive market, labor market and goods market. If it's competitive, then there's going to be a tendency for firms to, as they compete, to eliminate at least some of that discrimination. And the way to think about it is, if you were a firm and you could see that workers were getting paid lower than their marginal revenue product, which is what's happening in this picture. So just to be sure that these workers here are getting paid there, but the real marginal product, they're really producing that much up there. They're capable of producing that much up there. So if you're a firm and you see you're trying to maximize profits, that's what we're assuming is profit maximization is competitive. You want to do the best you can. Then you're going to say, hey, there's a deal here. I can pay maybe just that much and lure that worker away or hire a worker who otherwise wouldn't be hired and actually get increase in profits from it because the marginal revenue product is higher than the wage that would be paid down there. So there's going to be a tendency in competition to bid up the wages and to, if you like, arrest this discrimination problem because as it says in the picture, the actual marginal revenue product is higher than the wage. So other firms, as I've indicated, have this ability and incentive to hire away. And if they do it enough, it actually eliminates it. It brings you back up to the original marginal revenue product curve and where the wages were without discrimination. So The important aspects here is with competition, there is a tendency in the marketplace to offset this prejudice, to undo it. The prejudiced firms are going to end up losing relative to the non-prejudiced firms that don't discriminate. And that's really another aspect of competitive markets that you want to emphasize, another advantage of competitive markets. If there was some monopolies and the firms didn't have competition like this, then they might get away with the discrimination and prejudice. Even might get away with it with the laws that exist against it. So it's another reason why competition is an important and attractive feature of a market economy. Next problem, let's consider the minimum wage. Minimum wage is a law where the government says that firms must pay no less than a certain wage. In the state of California, it's $8, but they passed a law, it's going to $9 and $10, so it will soon be $10 an hour is the minimum firms can pay workers. So that's obviously going to affect the wage. It's going to mean that the wage is not simply at the intersection of labor demand and labor supply. It's not going to be equal to the marginal revenue product, but you can illustrate in the diagram and then get some interesting conclusions. So let's do that. Let's suppose there is a minimum wage at the point indicated in the picture. And you want to illustrate this importantly with two kinds of workers, those who are likely to be affected by the minimum wage and those that are not. Because even with a minimum wage of $10 an hour, many people get paid more than $10 an hour, so they're not affected. Those who get paid in the market less than $10 an hour will be affected. So to illustrate this important difference, we want to consider two labor supply and labor demand diagrams. On the right is the market for skilled workers, and note that that is drawn, the labor supply and labor demand curves are drawn where their intersection, their equilibrium is above the government-imposed minimum wage. So in that sense, the minimum wage is not binding for that skilled workers. It's going to be at the equilibrium. That wage is going to be at the equilibrium. On the left, we have unskilled workers, and the picture here assumes that their equilibrium wage, in the absence of a minimum wage, is lower than the government-imposed minimum. And so that's binding, if you like. So there's going to be a difference in these two markets about the impact of the minimum wage. So first, over on the left, you can see that since the wage is above the minimum, the quantity of labor demanded is going to be less than it would be at the equilibrium. You can see that over here. The equilibrium was down there, but with the firms having to pay a higher than that level, they will have a smaller quantity of labor demanded. And so along this labor demand curve, assuming it's correct and drawn correctly, there's going to be a reduction in employment because of the minimum wage. Of course, workers would like to be able to work at that higher wage. In fact, if the labor supply curve is upward sloping, they'd like to even work more than at the lower wage. But the problem is their jobs are not enough to generate that, so we have this surplus or the unemployment that's caused by that. On the right-hand side of the diagram, we don't have that problem. Those workers are basically going to be at their equilibrium at the higher point because they're above the $10 or whatever it happens to be. So an important result of this examination of the minimum wage is that there's two things happening for the unskilled workers. One, the quantity of labor demanded is going to go down, and therefore there'll be some unemployment caused by that. At the same time, those workers who are actually working, if you like, that quantity of labor there, they're getting a higher wage than they would have otherwise. So there's this trade-off or balance. A minimum wage legislation will benefit those who have a job and keep the job, and it will hurt those who are unable to get a job or lose a job. It's that trade-off. And any kind of time where there's an agreement to raise the minimum wage, that trade-off has to be faced. Oftentimes, the argument becomes how important is this labor demand effect? Some people will say, who would advocate the higher minimum wage, oh, the market doesn't work quite like this diagram. Firms are not competitive. They're not going to be affected very much. They might say that, in fact, the labor demand curve is quite steep, something like that maybe, rather than this for the unskilled workers, in which case there's not that much change in the quantity of labor. It could just go up to that point, so it's not quite so bad. So that's the kind of argument that takes place, but nonetheless, depending on the size and the quantities, there is this trade-off that is faced when one considers a minimum wage. And you want to consider the unskilled workers who are least able to get a job, probably the ones who have the least education, maybe high school dropouts, they may be hurt the most. And so you got to think about this as a public policy perspective. But the economics of it are clear, and the supply and demand model that we've derived illustrates that. And I think it's another reason why thinking about labor demand as what the firm is generating in the labor market through marginal revenue product helps understand this. The next issue I want to consider is the issue of unions and how you think about unions in labor supply and labor demand setup. So unions, of course, are situations where workers get together, join a union, and then they bargain for higher wages. To analyze this, we want to consider a market where the unions, involves union workers, and another market where there's non-union workers. We're going to focus on the private sector here, private sector unions, whatever it happens to be, in automobiles or whatever, and the non-union workers are the ones that are not unionized. So how do you describe this in this model? So, I mean, this is a pretty complicated topic, controversial. A lot of people are interested in it all the time. It's in the news. Can you analyze it? Well, you can. And so to represent the union workers bidding higher wages, you basically can just take your labor supply curve in this case and shift it up. So what they're doing, they're affecting the supply of labor. Remember, the unions are not working on labor demand, they're working on labor supply, the amount of work that the union workers do. And so if they raise the wage, bid up the wage somehow through bargaining, then this is simply going to be an increase in the labor supply curve to the point I've indicated there. And the prediction is pretty clear in this case. You're going to get a higher wage, that's what it's all about in a sense. Of course, to do that, there's going to have to be some smaller amount of employment. Just by definition, to get the higher wage, you might have to restrict union membership, and then you have to be in the union to get the job in this particular area. So or particular firm, so there'll be actually a reduction. That's what the model tells you, a reduction in the quantity of labor supplied and demand in this market. The other thing that's interesting is there's going to be clearly some workers who, because the quantity of labor is down, you've moved in this direction, that they're going to have to go somewhere to get a job. Where are they going to go? Well, they'll go to the non-union sector. And so the non-union sector is going to have a change. In particular, there's going to be a shift in the other direction of their labor supply curve, more workers coming in to that area. So that's where the extra labor goes, and it goes in the other direction in that case. But here, of course, since you shift the labor supply curve, you're going to get a lower wage. And so effectively, with the supply and demand model working this way, and with the competitive markets, the union pressure to have higher wages works for the union members, but it must have this offsetting effect for the non-union members. So that's what the supply and demand model tells you. There are other theories and other purposes of unions besides higher wages. Some people would argue that the unions are a way for grievances to be heard that are not capable otherwise, so that the unions may be providing services not represented in this. Also, some argue that the unions, in fact, organize the workplace better, so they might actually make the marginal product of workers increase, so perhaps it increases the labor demand curve. So these are the kind of debates that people have when they consider unions and the role of unions in the economy. And many of the ideas boil down to this issue of the supply and demand for labor, as in this diagram. As always, it depends on how steep the curves are and how far they shift. The last three items want to talk about without diagrams. They're pretty straightforward, but they're also fascinating, and they involve supply and demand. Compensating wage differentials. The idea here is that even though the marginal revenue product might be the same for two different jobs for a given worker, the worker's marginal revenue product would be the same, and therefore, according to the model we're dealing with, the wage should be the same. But quite frankly, some jobs are just more attractive than other jobs. For example, being a lifeguard might be kind of nice. You get to go to the summer and the beach and have fun like that. Your marginal product there might be the same, however it is, as if you're going to be a traffic cop and maybe not so pleasant as sitting on the beach. Both are trying to provide safety to a particular area, trying to prevent danger to individuals. So the marginal product might be the same. You could argue that the wage should be the same. But since one of them is much more attractive in terms of, we can imagine sitting on the beach versus driving around in a car, that it's quite likely that the lifeguards will be paid a lower wage because, in fact, the lifeguards get to sit on the beach and enjoy themselves, unlike the police officers. So that's called a compensating wage differential. The productivity of the worker might be the same as properly measured, but you're going to have a lower wage where the job is less attractive. And go in the reverse direction may be more dangerous to be a police officer or be in that line of work. And so even though the marginal product is the same in terms of delivering safety to the people, they will get a higher wage. So no matter how you look at it, that's the compensating wage differential. And a lot of situations are like that. So you might think they should be paid the same, but they're not because of these compensating wage differentials. Another example where the marginal revenue product might suggest that people should be paid the same, and they're not, is deferred compensation. Deferred compensation occurs, for example, in a law firm. A young associate will, just fresh out of law school, will get a job and be paid less than someone who's been there for a while, 10 or 20 years, has already become partner. What they're actually producing might be very much the same kind of advice. Yes, of course, you get more skilled over time, but in some sense, some of the things that they're doing is really generating the same marginal revenue product, if you like. So in this case, there's this deferred compensation. Some of the payment comes later. If you stick with the firm and become a partner, you're going to get a higher wage, higher compensation than you are when you're an associate. So the part of the deal is you join a law firm, you do well, and you stick around, and you're rewarded with a higher wage later. It makes sense in terms of incentives. You maybe work hard in order to become partner, or you basically don't go to some other firm because you're going to get a higher wage later. So these incentives take place, but it's an example where if you just naively looked at what the workers were doing, you'd say, hey, one's getting paid more than the other, but it becomes more sensible as a policy, something you can understand if you consider this deferred aspect. And then finally, wages are paid in different ways in most market economies. Some people just get a fixed salary. Say a professor just get a fixed salary for the year. In the period where classes are in session, working harder, or doing more teaching than periods when they're not in session. So technically speaking, your marginal product is higher when classes are in session than when they're not. But basically you got a fixed salary and you're getting paid the same amount throughout the year. So that's an example where if you look carefully, you see the teacher getting paid the same, even though the marginal productivity, marginal revenue product was different at those different periods. So it looks like it's violating the basic model. But the truth is, it makes sense not to keep moving the wage up and down, the salary up and down, just give a fixed salary. It's easier for everybody. And of course, they understand that there's going to be some busy times and some not so busy times. It doesn't always occur that way. Sometimes people are actually paid for how much they're producing. It's very common in agriculture that the workers will get a wage depending on how much they pick, how much fruit they pick. More apples picked will get a higher amount. That's called piece rates. In the case of piece rates, there's a very tight relationship between the marginal revenue product and the wage. In that case, it's going up and down directly with how much is being produced. You might not want to do that in all cases, so consider the truck drivers who are moving the fruit around, if you paid them according to how big their load was, you might see them racing around to get the stuff to market more quickly, and it cause a wreck and it'll be unsafe. And so frequently you'll see truck drivers less of a piece rate, more of a fixed salary kind of a situation. Not all the time, but frequently. And then of course there's the idea of bonuses. If you're doing really well in a job, you get a bonus, and you might not see that that bonus is related to your increase in marginal productivity or your increase in marginal revenue product. So you'll see this jumping around in the bonus or the amount you're paid. It seems unrelated to what's actually being produced if you look carefully hour by hour or day by day. All these things have incentive effects. Piece rates, if you pick more, you get more money. That provides incentives to have higher productivity. Deferred compensation gives young associate lawyers the incentive to become partner. The compensating wage differential gives people the incentive, say, to have more dangerous jobs like police officers. So they're all related to incentives, and those incentives are at the heart of the supply and demand model. Incentives meaning people are trying to either maximize your utility, if they're workers, consumers, or maximize their profits if they're firms. This is an example, several examples of how we use the supply and demand model to consider important issues in the real world. Thank you.